long after the Great Ice Age began to fade. When glaciers retreated and landscapes slowly transformed, a few of the giants still remained. Across isolated regions of the Earth, small populations of mammoths continued to move across the land, living remnants of a world that was already disappearing around them. These were not the vast herds that once crossed endless frozen plains, but the last survivors, adapted, reduced, and increasingly cut off from the environments that had once sustained their kind. The world was changing, and with it, the conditions that had allowed these giants to thrive were becoming more uncertain with each passing generation. As one begins to reflect on their final chapter, it becomes clear that their disappearance was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by isolation, shifting climates, and the subtle pressures that come with living in a world that is no longer the same. Their story is not just about extinction, but about survival at the very edge of possibility. As we explore this final chapter, we will step into the last days of the mammoths, understanding how they lived, how their world changed, and what ultimately led to the end of one of the most iconic giants to ever walk the earth. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Hidden History of Earth, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1: The Last Survivors. As one begins to consider the final phase of the mammoth's existence, it becomes evident that their world was no longer the vast and stable environment that had once supported their dominance, but a landscape in transition, where the conditions that had allowed them to thrive were slowly disappearing. The end of the Ice Age brought with it a gradual warming of the climate, a shift that unfolded over generations, altering the structure of ecosystems and transforming the environments that mammoths depended upon. As we reflect on this warming, it becomes clear that it did not simply change temperature, but influenced the entire system of life, affecting vegetation, water distribution, and the availability of resources. The open, cold grasslands that once stretched across continents began to shrink, replaced by forests and mixed vegetation that created new patterns of growth and movement. As one considers this transformation, it becomes evident that the mammoths, adapted to open environments where visibility and access to grass were abundant, would find these new landscapes increasingly difficult to navigate. The dense growth of trees and shrubs would limit their movement, reducing their ability to migrate across large distances and access the resources they needed to sustain their massive bodies. As we reflect on this restriction, it becomes clear that the scale at which mammoths operated was no longer supported by the environment, creating a mismatch between their needs and the conditions around them. The climate itself, though warmer, would introduce new forms of variability, with changing seasons affecting the availability of food and water in ways that were less predictable than before. As one considers these changes, it becomes evident that the stability that once defined the Ice Age environment was giving way to a system characterized by fluctuation and uncertainty. The presence of water, influenced by melting ice and changing precipitation patterns, would reshape the landscape, creating new rivers, wetlands, and lakes that alter the distribution of habitats. As we reflect on these changes, it becomes clear that the environment was not simply warming, but reorganizing itself, forming new ecosystems that were not ideally suited to the mammoth's way of life. The reduction of suitable habitats would lead to the fragmentation of mammoth populations, as groups become isolated in regions where conditions remain temporarily favorable. As one considers this fragmentation, it becomes evident that it introduces new challenges, as smaller populations are more vulnerable to environmental changes and less able to recover from disruptions. The movement of mammoths, once characterized by large-scale migration across open plains, would become more limited, confined to smaller areas where resources are still available. As we reflect on this limitation, it becomes clear that the ability to adapt to changing conditions would be constrained by the reduced range of movement, making it more difficult for mammoths to respond to environmental shifts. The interaction between mammoths and their environment would also change, as their feeding behavior influences vegetation in ways that may not align with the new conditions, creating further challenges for both the animals and the ecosystem. As one considers these interactions, it becomes evident that the relationship between mammoths and their environment, once balanced, was becoming strained under the pressure of change. The presence of other species, adapting more readily to the new conditions, would also influence the dynamics of the ecosystem, creating competition for resources that were becoming increasingly limited. As we continue to reflect on this period, it becomes clear that the world of the mammoths was fading not through a sudden event, but through a series of gradual changes that together altered the conditions under which they had once thrived, setting the stage for their eventual disappearance. As we continue to explore the fading world of the mammoths, it becomes evident that the changes affecting their environment were not isolated events, but part of a broader transformation that reshaped ecosystems across the planet, creating new conditions that favored different forms of life while challenging those that had evolved under Ice Age conditions. The expansion of forests into areas that were once open grasslands would create environments that are structurally different, with increased density of vegetation limiting visibility and altering the movement patterns of large animals. As one considers the impact of these changes, it becomes clear that mammoths, which relied on open spaces for both feeding and movement, would find these environments increasingly restrictive, reducing their ability to function as they once had. The presence of trees and dense plant growth would also influence the types of vegetation available, shifting from grasses to a more varied mix of plants that may not provide the same level of sustenance for these large herbivores. As we reflect on this shift, it becomes evident that the dietary needs of mammoths would be harder to meet, creating a situation where energy intake may not match the demands of their large bodies. The seasonal patterns of the environment would also change, with warmer temperatures influencing the timing of plant growth and the availability of resources throughout the year. As one considers these seasonal changes, it becomes clear that the predictability that once guided the behavior of mammoths was diminishing, making it more difficult for them to align their movement and feeding patterns with the availability of resources. The presence of smaller, more adaptable species within these changing ecosystems would further influence the distribution of resources, as these animals are able to exploit a wider range of conditions and may compete with mammoths for food and space. As we reflect on this competition, it becomes evident that the mammoth specialization, once an advantage, was becoming a limitation in an environment that required flexibility. The fragmentation of habitats would also lead to the isolation of mammoth populations, creating groups that are separated by physical barriers such as forests, rivers, or unsuitable terrain. As one considers the effects of this isolation, it becomes clear that it would reduce genetic diversity and limit the ability of populations to adapt to changing conditions, increasing their vulnerability to environmental stress. The smaller size of these isolated populations would also make them more susceptible to random events, such as changes in climate or resource availability, which can have a greater impact when fewer individuals are present. As we reflect on these factors, it becomes evident that the decline of the mammoths was not driven by a single cause, but by a combination of environmental changes that together created conditions that were increasingly difficult to navigate. The world that had once supported their existence was transforming into something new, and while life continued to adapt and evolve within this changing system, the mammoths found themselves at the edge of that transformation, unable to fully adjust to the new conditions. As we continue to reflect on this period, it becomes clear that the story of the last mammoths is one of gradual change and adaptation, where the persistence of these animals represents both the strength of their evolutionary history and the limits of their ability to survive in a world that was no longer the same. As one begins to consider the later stages of mammoth existence, it becomes evident that one of the most defining features of their final chapter was isolation, a condition that gradually separated populations from one another and altered the way these animals lived, moved, and interacted with their environment. Unlike the earlier periods of the Ice Age, where mammoths roamed across vast and connected landscapes, the changing climate and shifting ecosystems began to divide these once continuous habitats into smaller, fragmented regions. As we reflect on this fragmentation, it becomes clear that mammoth populations were increasingly confined to areas where suitable conditions still existed, often separated by forests, bodies of water, or terrain that was no longer favorable for their survival. This separation would lead to the formation of isolated groups, each adapting to the specific conditions of their environment, but also facing new challenges that come with reduced connectivity. As one considers the impact of isolation, it becomes evident that the ability of these populations to maintain stability would depend on the resources available within their limited range, as well as their capacity to adapt to local conditions. The movement patterns that once allowed mammoths to follow seasonal changes and access distant resources would be restricted, creating a situation where survival depended on what could be found within a much smaller area. As we reflect on this limitation, it becomes clear that the reduction in mobility would affect not only access to food and water, but also the interactions between individuals and groups, altering the social structure of mammoth populations. The presence of smaller groups would influence behavior, as the dynamics of large herds give way to more localized interactions, potentially affecting communication, reproduction, and the overall cohesion of the species. As one considers these changes, it becomes evident that the mammoths were adapting not only to environmental shifts, but also to a new way of living that differs from their earlier existence. The resources within these isolated environments would vary, with some areas providing sufficient vegetation to support populations, while others may be more limited, creating pressure on individuals to compete for what is available. As we reflect on this variability, it becomes clear that survival would depend on the ability to utilize resources efficiently, as well as the capacity to endure periods of scarcity. The presence of other species within these environments would further influence resource availability, as competition for food and space becomes more pronounced in areas where habitats are limited. As one considers this competition, it becomes evident that mammoths, despite their size and strength, would need to adapt to a system where they are no longer the dominant influence on the environment. The physical characteristics that once allowed them to thrive in open, cold landscapes may not provide the same advantages in these new conditions, where flexibility and adaptability become more important. As we reflect on these challenges, it becomes clear that isolation represents both a response to environmental change and a contributing factor to the difficulties faced by the mammoths. The separation of populations reduces the exchange of individuals between groups, limiting genetic diversity and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. As one considers the implications of reduced genetic diversity, it becomes evident that it can affect the health and resilience of populations, making them more vulnerable to environmental stress and disease. The combination of limited resources, restricted movement, and reduced genetic variation creates a scenario where survival becomes increasingly uncertain, as each factor contributes to the overall pressure on the population. As we continue to reflect on this period, it becomes clear that life in isolation represents a critical stage in the decline of the mammoths, where the conditions that once supported their widespread presence are replaced by environments that challenge their ability to persist. As we continue to explore the effects of isolation on the last mammoth populations, it becomes evident that this separation did not occur uniformly, but varied across different regions, creating a range of conditions under which these animals attempted to survive. Some populations found themselves on isolated islands, cut off from the mainland by rising sea levels, while others remained in remote continental regions where suitable habitats persisted for longer periods. As one considers these different scenarios, it becomes clear that the experience of isolation would differ depending on the specific conditions of each environment, influencing how populations adapt and respond to change. In island environments, for example, the limited size of the habitat would impose constraints on the availability of resources, creating a system where the carrying capacity of the environment is relatively low. As we reflect on this limitation, it becomes evident that populations in such environments would need to adjust to a reduced availability of food, potentially leading to changes in body size, behavior, or reproductive strategies. The concept of adaptation in isolated environments highlights the ability of species to respond to specific conditions, but also underscores the limitations of such adaptations when faced with ongoing change. As one considers the balance between adaptation and limitation, it becomes clear that while some populations may persist for extended periods, their long-term survival remains uncertain. The absence of predators in certain isolated environments may reduce immediate threats, but it does not eliminate the challenges posed by limited resources and environmental variability. As we reflect on this aspect, it becomes evident that isolation can create a situation where some pressures are reduced while others become more significant, shaping the overall experience of survival. The social structure of mammoth populations would also be influenced by isolation, as smaller group sizes may affect communication and the transmission of knowledge between individuals. As one considers the importance of social interaction, it becomes apparent that it plays a role in the survival of many species, contributing to the ability to locate resources, avoid danger, and maintain group cohesion. The reduction in group size may therefore impact the effectiveness of these processes, creating additional challenges for isolated populations. The genetic consequences of isolation would further influence the resilience of these groups. As limited breeding opportunities reduce genetic diversity, increasing the likelihood of inherited conditions that can affect survival. As we reflect on these genetic factors, it becomes clear that they represent a long-term challenge that may not be immediately visible, but can have significant effects over time. The interaction between environmental conditions, resource availability, social structure, and genetic factors creates a complex scenario where the survival of mammoth populations depends on multiple interconnected elements. As one considers the broader implications of these interactions, it becomes evident that isolation is not merely a physical separation, but a process that influences every aspect of life within these populations. The persistence of mammoths in these isolated environments represents a testament to their adaptability, but also highlights the limitations of that adaptability in the face of continuous change. As we continue to reflect on this period, it becomes clear that life in isolation was both a means of survival and a step toward eventual disappearance, illustrating how the same conditions that allow a species to persist can also contribute to its decline over time. One begins to consider the final phase of the mammoth's existence. It becomes evident that their continued survival during this period was not a sign of stability, but rather an indication that they were existing at the very limits of what their environment could support, holding on within conditions that were increasingly unfavorable. The world around them had already undergone significant transformation, with the expansive grasslands of the Ice Age largely replaced by environments that did not fully meet their needs. Yet in certain isolated regions, enough of the old conditions remained for small populations to persist. As we reflect on this persistence, it becomes clear that survival at this stage required a delicate balance between the availability of resources and the ability of the mammoths to utilize them effectively. The reduced size of these populations meant that each individual played a more significant role in maintaining the continuity of the species, as the loss of even a few members could have a noticeable impact on the overall stability of the group. As one considers the implications of such small population sizes, it becomes evident that the margin for error was extremely limited, with survival depending on a combination of favorable conditions and the absence of significant disruptions. The environment, though still capable of supporting these animals to some extent, would present ongoing challenges, including variations in food availability and changes in climate that could affect the growth of vegetation. As we reflect on these environmental pressures, it becomes clear that the mammoths were no longer thriving, but merely enduring, adapting as best they could to conditions that were no longer ideal. The movement of these animals, once characterized by large-scale migrations across open landscapes, would now be confined to smaller areas, where they must navigate a limited range of resources and environmental conditions. As one considers this restriction, it becomes evident that the ability to respond to changes in the environment was significantly reduced, making it more difficult to adapt to fluctuations in resource availability. The social structure of these populations would also be affected by their reduced size, as smaller groups may experience changes in behavior, communication, and reproduction that influence their overall resilience. As we reflect on these social dynamics, it becomes clear that the loss of individuals could disrupt established patterns of interaction, creating additional challenges for survival. The genetic consequences of small population size would further contribute to the vulnerability of these groups, as limited genetic diversity can affect the health and adaptability of individuals, reducing their ability to cope with environmental stress. As one considers the long-term effects of reduced genetic variation, it becomes evident that it can lead to a gradual decline in the overall fitness of the population, making it more susceptible to disease and other challenges. The combination of environmental pressures, limited resources, and genetic factors creates a scenario where survival becomes increasingly difficult, even in the absence of immediate threats. As we continue to reflect in this period, it becomes clear that the mammoths were existing in a state of gradual decline, where each generation faced conditions that were slightly more challenging than the last. The persistence of these animals during this time highlights their resilience and adaptability, but also underscores the limits of those traits when faced with ongoing change. As one considers the broader implications of this situation, it becomes evident that survival at the edge of extinction isn't a stable condition, but a temporary state that depends on the continuation of specific circumstances, which may not persist indefinitely. The mammoths, in holding on for as long as they did, demonstrate the ability of life to endure under challenging conditions, but also reveal how even the most well-adapted species can struggle when the environment shifts beyond their capacity to adjust. As we continue to reflect on the final stages of mammoth survival, it becomes evident that this period represents a complex interplay between resilience and limitation, where the ability to persist is constantly challenged by the conditions of the environment and the internal dynamics of the population. The concept of survival during this stage extends beyond the immediate ability to find food or avoid danger, encompassing the broader capacity of the population to maintain itself over time in the face of ongoing change. As one considers this broader perspective, it becomes clear that survival is not simply about the present moment, but about the ability to sustain future generations, a process that becomes increasingly difficult as conditions become less favorable. The reproductive success of these populations would be influenced by a range of factors, including the availability of resources, the health of individuals, and the stability of social structures, all of which are affected by the challenges of living in a changing environment. As we reflect on these factors, it becomes evident that the ability to reproduce successfully is a critical component of survival, and that any reduction in reproductive success can have significant consequences for the long-term viability of the population. The presence of environmental variability would further complicate this process, as fluctuations in climate and resource availability create conditions that are not always conducive to raising offspring. As one considers the impact of such variability, it becomes clear that it introduces an element of unpredictability into the survival process, making it more difficult for populations to maintain stability over time. The interaction between environmental conditions and biological processes creates a system where the outcome is influenced by multiple factors, each contributing to the overall trajectory of the population. As we reflect on this system, it becomes evident that the mammoths were navigating a landscape that was no longer aligned with their needs, requiring them to adapt continuously to conditions that were shifting in ways that could not be fully anticipated. The presence of humans during this period would add another layer of complexity, as their activities influence both the environment and the populations within it, contributing to the pressures faced by the mammoths. As one considers the role of humans, it becomes clear that they represent an additional factor that interacts with existing challenges, further influencing the conditions of survival. The cumulative effect of these pressures would create a situation where the balance between survival and decline becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, leading to a gradual reduction in population size and resilience. As we continue to reflect on this process, it becomes clear that the final disappearance of the mammoths was not the result of a sudden event, but the culmination of a long period of adaptation, struggle, and gradual decline, where the conditions necessary for survival were slowly eroded over time. Chapter 2: The Final Disappearance. As one begins to examine the final chapter of the mammoth's existence, it becomes evident that their story did not end all at once across the planet, but instead continued in isolated pockets of survival, where small populations persisted long after the disappearance of their relatives from the mainland. These last mammoths, often confined to remote regions such as isolated islands or distant northern landscapes, lived in environments that retained some of the characteristics of the Ice Age, even as the rest of the world continued to change. As we reflect on these isolated populations, it becomes clear that their survival was closely tied to the specific conditions of their environment, where colder climates and limited human presence allowed them to endure for longer periods. The isolation of these populations, however, would also introduce new challenges, as the separation from larger groups reduced genetic diversity and limited the ability of individuals to find mates outside of their immediate population. As one considers the implications of this isolation, it becomes evident that while it provided a temporary refuge from broader environmental changes, it also created conditions that could lead to long-term vulnerability. The environments in which these mammoths lived would vary, but often included landscapes that are smaller and more constrained than the vast plains of the Ice Age, requiring adaptation to limited resources and restricted movement. As we reflect on these conditions, it becomes clear that survival in such environments would depend on the careful balance between resource availability and population size, where even small changes could have significant effects. The vegetation in these regions would need to support the dietary needs of the mammoths, providing sufficient plant material to sustain their large bodies. Yet the limited size of the habitat would impose constraints on how much vegetation could be produced. As one considers this limitation, it becomes evident that the carrying capacity of these environments would be relatively low, meaning that only a small number of individuals could be supported at any given time. The movement of mammoths within these confined spaces would also differ from their earlier behavior, as the absence of large-scale migration patterns requires them to rely on local resources and adapt to seasonal variations within a limited range. As we reflect on this change in behavior, it becomes clear that the flexibility of these animals would be tested, as they must adjust to conditions that differ from those in which they originally evolved. The absence of certain predators in some isolated environments may reduce immediate threats, allowing populations to persist without the same level of pressure from predation. Yet this absence does not eliminate the challenges posed by limited resources and environmental variability. As one considers the role of predators, it becomes evident that their absence may alter the dynamics of the ecosystem, affecting the balance between species and the distribution of resources. The presence of humans, while reduced in some of these isolated regions, may still influence the environment and the organisms within it, introducing additional pressures that affect survival. As we reflect on these factors, it becomes clear that the last mammoth populations existed in a delicate state, where their continued survival depended on a combination of favorable conditions and the absence of significant disruptions. The gradual changes in climate, even within these isolated environments, would continue to influence the availability of resources, creating fluctuations that populations must navigate in order to persist. As one considers the impact of these fluctuations, it becomes evident that even minor changes can have amplified effects in small populations, where the margin for survival is already limited. The history of these last mammoths, therefore, is one of persistence under constrained conditions, where the factors that allow them to survive also contribute to the challenges they face. As we continue to reflect on this period, it becomes clear that these isolated populations represent the final remnants of a once widespread species, holding on within environments that offer both refuge and limitation, illustrating the complex interplay between survival and decline. As we continue to explore the final isolated populations of mammoths, it becomes evident that their existence during this stage represents a balance between adaptation and constraint, where the conditions that allowed them to survive also imposed limitations that influenced their long-term viability. The reduced size of these populations would affect not only their ability to maintain genetic diversity, but also their resilience to environmental changes, as smaller populations are more vulnerable to fluctuations in climate and resource availability. As one considers the importance of genetic diversity, it becomes clear that it plays a crucial role in the ability of species to adapt to changing conditions, providing the variation necessary for individuals to respond to new challenges. The isolation of mammoth populations would limit this variation, increasing the likelihood of inherited conditions that can affect health and reproduction, contributing to a gradual decline in population fitness. As we reflect on these genetic factors, it becomes evident that they represent a long-term challenge that may not be immediately visible, but can have significant effects over time. The environments in which these mammoths lived would also continue to change, influenced by broader climatic trends that affect temperature, precipitation, and vegetation patterns. As one considers these ongoing changes, it becomes clear that the stability of these environments cannot be assumed, and that even isolated regions are subject to the same forces that transformed the rest of the planet. The availability of resources within these environments would therefore fluctuate, creating periods of abundance and scarcity that populations must navigate. As we reflect on this variability, it becomes evident that the ability to endure periods of scarcity is a key component of survival. Yet the limited size of these populations reduces their capacity to recover from such challenges. The interaction between environmental variability and population dynamics creates a scenario where survival becomes increasingly uncertain, as each challenge reduces the overall resilience of the population. The social structure of these mammoths would also be influenced by their reduced numbers, affecting how individuals interact, communicate, and reproduce. As one considers the importance of social behavior, it becomes clear that it contributes to the ability of a species to function effectively within its environment, and that disruptions to social structure can have significant consequences for survival. The absence of larger herds may reduce the benefits of collective behavior, such as increased awareness of threats and more efficient use of resources, further contributing to the challenges faced by these populations. As we reflect on these factors, it becomes evident that the final isolated mammoths were living under conditions that required constant adaptation, yet offered limited opportunity for recovery from setbacks. The presence of humans, even in small numbers, could influence these populations, as their activities affect both the environment and the availability of resources, introducing additional pressures that compound existing challenges. As one considers the cumulative effect of these pressures, it becomes clear that the final disappearance of the mammoths was not the result of a single event, but the outcome of a gradual process where multiple factors combine to reduce the ability of the population to sustain itself. As we continue to reflect on this final stage, it becomes clear that the story of the last mammoth's icon of persistence in the face of limitation, where survival is maintained for as long as conditions allow, but ultimately constrained by factors that cannot be overcome indefinitely. As one begins to examine the final stages leading to the disappearance of the last mammoth populations, it becomes evident that there was no single dramatic moment that marked their end, but rather a gradual approach toward a breaking point, where the combined pressures of environment, isolation, and internal population dynamics reached a level that could no longer be sustained. The conditions that had allowed these animals to persist for thousands of years in isolated environments were becoming increasingly unstable, as small changes in climate and resource availability began to have disproportionately large effects on populations that were already limited in size. As we reflect on this instability, it becomes clear that the margin for survival had become extremely narrow, where even minor disruptions, such as a slightly harsher season, a temporary shortage of food, or a change in vegetation patterns, could significantly impact the ability of individuals to survive and reproduce. The concept of a breaking point in this context is not defined by a single event, but by the accumulation of stresses that gradually reduce the resilience of the population, making it more difficult to recover from each successive challenge. As one considers this accumulation, it becomes evident that the mammoths were living in a state where survival depended on a delicate balance that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The availability of food, for example, would fluctuate with changes in climate and vegetation, creating periods where resources are insufficient to support the needs of the population. As we reflect on these fluctuations, it becomes clear that they would affect not only individual survival, but also reproductive success, as animals in poorer condition are less able to produce and support offspring. The reduction in reproductive success would further contribute to population decline, creating a cycle where fewer individuals are born and more are lost over time. As one considers this cycle, it becomes evident that it represents a key mechanism in the gradual approach toward extinction, where the balance between birth and death shifts in a way that cannot be reversed. The isolation of these populations would amplify the effects of such changes, as the lack of new individuals entering the population limits the ability to recover from losses. As we reflect on this limitation, it becomes clear that the resilience of the population is closely tied to its size and connectivity, both of which are reduced in isolated environments. The genetic consequences of small population size would also play a role in this process, as reduced diversity can lead to increased susceptibility to disease and environmental stress. As one considers these genetic factors, it becomes evident that they contribute to the overall vulnerability of the population, making it more difficult to withstand the challenges posed by changing conditions. The interaction between environmental variability, resource availability, and genetic health creates a complex system where multiple factors influence the trajectory of the population. As we continue to reflect on this system, it becomes clear that the breaking point represents a stage where the cumulative effects of these factors reach a level that exceeds the capacity of the population to adapt or recover. The mammoths, having persisted through earlier changes, now faced a situation where the conditions required for survival were no longer consistently present, leading to a gradual decline that would ultimately result in their disappearance. As we continue to explore the concept of the breaking point in the extinction of the last mammoths, it becomes evident that this stage reflects not only the external pressures of the environment, but also the internal limitations of the population, where the ability to sustain itself over time becomes increasingly compromised. The reduction in population size would affect the structure and function of the group, influencing social interactions, reproductive patterns, and the overall stability of the population. As one considers the impact of reduced numbers, it becomes clear that the loss of individuals can disrupt established social structures, affecting communication and cooperation within the group. The absence of experienced individuals, for example, may reduce the ability of the population to respond effectively to environmental challenges, as knowledge and behavior that contribute to survival are not passed on to future generations. As we reflect on this loss of knowledge, it becomes evident that it represents an often overlooked aspect of extinction, where the disappearance of individuals leads to the loss of information that is essential for survival. The reproductive dynamics of the population would also be affected by reduced numbers, as fewer individuals mean fewer opportunities for successful breeding, particularly in environments where individuals are spread across limited areas. As one considers the implications of reduced reproductive opportunities, it becomes evident that they contribute to a decline in population growth, making it more difficult to offset losses caused by environmental factors. The interaction between reduced reproduction and increased mortality creates a feedback loop where the population continues to decline, approaching a point where recovery is no longer possible. As we reflect on this feedback loop, it becomes clear that it represents a critical stage in the extinction process, where the trajectory of the population is set toward eventual disappearance. The presence of environmental variability, including changes in climate and resource availability, would continue to influence this process, creating conditions that further challenge the ability of the population to survive. As one considers the role of environmental variability, it becomes evident that it introduces unpredictability into the system, making it more difficult for the population to maintain stability over time. The cumulative effect of these factors, reduced population size, loss of genetic diversity, disrupted social structures, and environmental variability, creates a scenario where the breaking point is not a single moment, but a threshold beyond which recovery is no longer possible. As we continue to reflect on this stage, it becomes clear that the disappearance of the last mammoths represents the culmination of a long process of decline, where the balance between survival and extinction gradually shifts until the conditions necessary for persistence can no longer be met. One begins to imagine the very final stage of the mammoth's existence. It becomes evident that this moment is not marked by a dramatic event, but by a quiet and gradual fading, where the last individuals continue to live within an environment that no longer supports the continuation of tier species. The idea of the last mammoth is not necessarily a single identifiable individual, but a representation of the final generation of a population that has been reduced to its smallest possible size, existing at the edge of survival with no path toward recovery. As we reflect on this stage, it becomes clear that the conditions required to sustain a population, sufficient resources, stable environment, and the ability to reproduce successfully, were no longer present in a consistent or reliable way. The environment, though still capable of supporting life in general, had shifted away from the conditions that once favored mammoths, creating a mismatch between the needs of the species and the realities of the landscape. As one considers this mismatch, it becomes evident that the final individuals were living in a world that was no longer aligned with their evolutionary adaptations, requiring them to endure conditions that were increasingly difficult to navigate. The absence of a large population would also mean the absence of social structures that once supported survival, such as group movement, shared knowledge, and collective awareness of the environment. As we reflect on this loss of social structure, it becomes clear that it would affect not only the behavior of individuals, but also their ability to respond to challenges, as the benefits of group living are no longer available. The concept of reproduction, which is essential for the continuation of any species, would be severely limited at this stage, as the small number of individuals reduces the likelihood of successful breeding, particularly if those individuals are isolated or separated by distance. As one considers the implications of this limitation, it becomes evident that even if individuals continue to survive for some time, the absence of reproduction ensures that the population cannot be sustained beyond the current generation. The environment itself would continue to change, influenced by broader climatic trends and ecological shifts, further reducing the suitability of habitats for mammoths. As we reflect on these ongoing changes, it becomes clear that the final stage of mammoth existence is defined not by a single catastrophic event, but by a gradual narrowing of possibilities, where each factor contributes to the reduction of survival options. The presence of other species, better adapted to the new conditions, would highlight the changing nature of the ecosystem, as these organisms occupy niches that mammoths can no longer fill. As one considers this transition, it becomes evident that the disappearance of the mammoths represents a shift in the structure of the ecosystem, where the roles once played by these giants are replaced by other forms of life. The final individuals, therefore, exist as remnants of a previous era, carrying with them the history of a world that has already transformed. As we continue to reflect on this stage, it becomes clear that the concept of the last mammoth is not just about the end of a species, but about the end of a particular way of life shaped by conditions that no longer exist. The quiet nature of this disappearance underscores the gradual process of extinction, where the absence of dramatic events does not diminish the significance of the outcome, but rather emphasizes the cumulative effect of long-term change. As we move toward a deeper understanding of the final disappearance of the mammoths, it becomes evident that this moment represents more than just the loss of a single species, but a broader transformation in the relationship between life and environment, where the conditions that once supported certain forms of life are replaced by those that favor others. The final mammoths, existing at the edge of extinction, would have experienced a world that is fundamentally different from the one in which their ancestors thrived, where the patterns of climate, vegetation, and interaction have shifted in ways that are not conducive to their survival. As we reflect on this transformation, it becomes clear that the disappearance of the mammoths is part of a larger process of ecological change, where the composition of life on Earth evolves over time in response to changing conditions. The inability of the mammoths to adapt to these new conditions highlights the importance of flexibility in survival, illustrating how species that are highly specialized may be more vulnerable to environmental change. As one considers the broader implications of this vulnerability, it becomes evident that the story of the mammoths serves as an example of how even the most successful and widespread species can decline when the conditions that support them are altered. The presence of humans within these changing environments would also play a role in shaping the final stages of this process, as their activities influence both the environment and the distribution of resources, contributing to the pressures faced by the remaining populations. As we reflect on the role of humans, it becomes clear that they are part of the complex network of factors that influence extinction, interacting with environmental changes in ways that can accelerate or amplify their effects. The final disappearance of the mammoths, therefore, is not the result of a single cause, but the outcome of multiple interacting factors that together create conditions that are no longer suitable for their survival. As one considers the broader context of this disappearance, it becomes evident that extinction is a natural part of the history of life, yet it also reflects the delicate balance that exists between species and their environments. The story of the last mammoth serves as a reminder of how this balance can be disrupted, leading to outcomes that are both gradual and irreversible. As we continue to reflect on this final stage, it becomes clear that the disappearance of the mammoths marks the end of an era, where the giants that once roamed vast landscapes are replaced by new forms of life that are better suited to the conditions of a changing world. As we reflect on the final days of the mammoths, it becomes clear that their story is not one-off sudden disappearance, but of slow and quiet fading. A species holding on for as long as it could in a world that was steadily moving beyond it. They did not vanish in a single moment, but over generations, as the balance between survival and change slowly tipped in a direction they could not follow. These giants were not weak, nor were they unfit for survival. For thousands of years, they thrived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. But when the world began to shift, when climates warmed, habitats changed, and populations became isolated, the very traits that once made them successful became limitations in a new and unfamiliar landscape. What makes the story of the last mammoth so compelling is how quiet it is. There was no single event that marked their end, only the gradual disappearance of individuals, until one day, without ceremony, they were simply gone. And in that silence, we are left with a reminder of how closely life is tied to the world around it, how even the most powerful creatures depend on balance, and how that balance can change over time. If you found this journey into the last days of the mammoths interesting and want to explore more ancient worlds, lost giants, and untold stories of Earth's past, make sure to subscribe and stay connected for more.